There's probably no greater freedom we enjoy or greater privilege we enjoy on this earth than our freedom. No greater privilege to enjoy and, I might add, to protect. We believe in it so firmly that we, as a nation, pulled free of the controls of England many, many decades ago. We determined we would not live under the authority of England's king, even if it meant giving our own blood for our freedom. And we did. And we gained it. And we protect it. We even believe in it so strongly that we help other countries whose freedom is being threatened. When Europe, under the boot of Hitler, found its freedom slowly eroding, we took up arms and we fought for them and with them that our and their freedom might not be removed. At the same time, when the imperialistic attitude of Japan on the other side of our nation came at us with such aggression, we determined it wasn't too great a price to pay to double our efforts and move from the European theater of war even into the Far East theater of war. And we fought on both sides. And if you were to ask any of us raised at that time, and any of us engaged in the wars of that time on either side, why we're doing it, it would be answered: for freedom. It is for freedom that we fight these wars. We believe that not only as a nation, we believe it personally. In relaxed and enjoyable manners. Ask people who climb mountains, why do you climb the mountain? Climbers will tell you, because you feel so free. I often think when you fall, you also feel free from it. Always been a strange thing for me. Why do people parachute from planes? There's a freedom in that fall. Why do motorcyclists get on two wheels and go out on the road? I don't know of one that answers any other way, but it's the feeling of freedom. Why do sailors sail in rough seas and calm seas, and from one port to another? They'll tell you it's the sense of freedom that you feel. We love freedom. We love it when we are around it, when we are immersed in it, when we can feel it. That's why we say often, give me the back roads, which are often called the open road. Back in 1947, the current founder of Route 66 Association, a man named Tom Snyder, that's 5 decades ago, was a little boy when he made his first journey on the route. And he thinks back with these words: open road travelers are made more than born. They are as different from theme park tourists as anything you could imagine. Tourists rush. Travelers mosey. Tourists look for souvenirs. Travelers seek out souvenir makers. Tourists want to see all the right places. Travelers simply go into the country. Travelers are openly romantic about the going itself, the adventurous possibility of it all. Some who are also writers and photographers create images of what they find. Others just take everything to heart, sharing their keepsakes through a love for us all. If you are to become a traveler, it helps if your first big trip as a child is a Lulu. Mine was. We were California bound on Route 66. The first winter day's run south to St. Louis was blurry with snow. And I am embarrassed to recall that my just traded Flash Gordon and Green Lantern comics were more interesting to me than anything passing by our old Buick Roadmaster. So I read and slept mostly. At the famous Chain of Rocks crossing, which connects Illinois with Missouri, my father slowed to a crawl, waking me to see the icy Mississippi. Girder shadows slipped over us as we rolled out beyond the many fortresses standing guard in the main channel below. Reaching the far side, I could just make out a federal highway shield, which read Missouri, U.S. 66, West. For a kid who had never traveled more than a few miles from home, that sign and everything it conjured up was a revelation. I believe it was the first time I saw myself in relation to the world instead of the other way around. Highway 66 had my attention. Soon Missouri's craggy limestone gave way to the round-shouldered hills of Oklahoma. Gray winter land and frozen surfaces turned to boggy red, with splashes of green still showing. Even the concrete in the highway took on a strange new pinkish hue. From there it was up onto the high plains of the Texas Panhandle, flat-featured and unforgiving. Near sundown each day, most travelers on Route 66 would find a cozy motor court and stay put. We frequently just kept going. At night, out on that old two-lane, it was common to drive for an hour or more without seeing another pair of sealed beams. Rolling along in the darkness for miles without finding an encouraging highway sign, we would sense a feeling of tension creeping into the car. Were we still on the route? Maybe we should have quit at the last town. How's the fuel? Will we make it? No filling stations way out here. Then suddenly, on the rim of the surrounding blackness, some tiny oases of light would appear. Texola, Shamrock, McLean. Friendly roadside neon, like airport runway lights, guiding us into a safe night's rest. In the morning, still, cool air with frost on the windshield. Time enough to appreciate a leather jacket on the way over to a steamy cafe, proverbial said to be the best place in town, which often as not it was. By the time we reached the rimrock country of New Mexico and Arizona, my consciousness had been altered forever. I didn't think of it that way, of course, but I certainly felt it. Everything seemed connected in some intangible way. I sensed something resonant in the cliff faces, in the sky, in the endless run of highway beneath, something that seemed to be in me, too. That was back in 1947. And if time has changed the highway, its attraction for me has never diminished. The interstate is safer, easier now, of course. Yet even a brief drive along old Route 66 reminds us of what is missing on the superhighway and in our lives. On the old road, every rise or dip, every side road junction, every new direction gives rise to the feeling we have actually been somewhere, that we are actually getting somewhere. In between, the ever-changing roadway helps us regain the experience of going rather than merely being transported from place to place. A stop in one of the small towns most anywhere along old Route 66 offers evidence that life begins at the off-ramp. I like that line. Away from the super slab, you can still order a piece of pie from the person who baked it. Still get your change right from the shop owner. Still take a moment to care and to be cared about. A long way from home. So beyond the sense of history and romance and adventure evoked by the old road, there's something else. a feeling of personal involvement. And that's what Route 66, the Mother Road, conveys so well. And I would add, that's what the original Route 66 through the Scriptures conveys so well. A sense of history, an intimate romance, if you will, with the living God. The high adventure of journeying with Him through our struggles, of what might be called, from His words, surrounding blackness, and on into the oasis of light provided by our Savior's death and resurrection. When you've had enough of the wide, broad, well-traveled interstate superhighway that the majority monotonously travel, the mind-numbing way that seems right, and you realize life isn't there, you discover it really begins at the off-ramp. Really at the narrow gate, the narrow bridge that opens up a far more narrow road, full of dangerous curves, yes, but there are also roadside parks, which allow time to care and to be cared about while you're a long way from home. I think that's another reason we enjoy getting together for this week at Mount Hermon. Though many of us don't know one another, we sense folks care. They care about us. They really do. And thank God we are free at last, though still a long way from home. Free at last. Free to be and to let others be. Free to choose and allow others to. Or are you? Are you really free? Or are you afraid to be? Or have you given up your freedom without a fight? Because some have intimidated you out of being who you really are, and God would have you be into becoming who they want you to be. In Galatians chapter 5, I read some pretty strong words from a man who knew what he was writing about. His name is Paul, the great apostle of grace, who says, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free." First glance, it almost looks like a Yogi Berra comment, doesn't it? I mean, it was for freedom that He set us free. Well, wait a minute. What does that mean? It means Christ died that we might be liberated, that we might be freed from the bondage that trapped us and the people who entrapped us all those years. It was for freedom from that He set us free. And he adds, "Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." Seems a strange thing that anyone would have to emphasize this to a body of mainly Americans. Freedom is our middle name. That's why those monuments were built at our capital. That's why we feel extra special when someone really sings the Star-Spangled Banner. I mean the notes. And stays on the notes. And carries it all the way through as Francis Scott Key meant it to be sung. And the words, not just the first stanza, but the second and the third. There's something about that great statement of freedom that makes us stand a little taller. And I find some Americans are willing to fight to the end, if necessary, for freedom, but they're willing to give up their freedom as a Christian. I've never quite been able to figure that out. Giving room for the legalists to tell us how to live our lives because they happen to be a few years up on us in age, or maybe have a degree we don't have, or they have a role to fill or a title that's theirs that we don't have, or maybe we just consider ourselves some of those peace at any price type people when it comes to spiritual things. Well, I'm here to tell you it's not worth giving up. Don't give it up. In fact, the Galatians had. Go back to chapter 3. You foolish Galatians. One paraphrase calls them stupid. You stupid Galatians. Who has bewitched you? Another paraphrase. Who has hypnotized you? I mean, how stupid can you get, Galatians? You folks who have known of liberty and freedom. Verse 3, are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected in flesh? Having come to Christ by faith and found that that narrow bridge opens to a road that is available to you by the power of the Spirit to be led by Him and no longer in bondage to an enemy who you once served or to people who would control you now? Who has hypnotized you? Donald Campbell in the Bible Knowledge Commentary writes very wisely, Paul's tone was direct and severe. To embrace a doctrine which declared the death of Christ unnecessary was irrational. They were without excuse. Paul asked if they were so foolish as to think they could begin the Christian life in one way and move on to spiritual maturity in another. This was what the Judaizers promoted. What Judaizers did in the first century, legalists do in the 20th century. And don't forget it. Grace killers today will tell you to stay off the open road. Get back on the interstate where they are. They want you to be as miserable as they are. They want you to know the monotony of the big wide road like they know it. And they will make sure you get back on it. If you find give them any reason to believe you're willing to yield, they'll put you back on it and control your life. They'll tell you what to dress. They'll tell you what to drink. They'll tell you how to eat. They'll tell you how to act. They'll tell you the songs to sing. And ones you can't sing, they'll tell you the length of your hair. They'll tell you how to dress. They'll tell you what to drive. They'll tell you what's appropriate, all of which falls in the category of basic mediocrity, which means monotony. Misery. And they call it the abundant Christian life. Are you kidding? That's abundance? That you do anything a little bit extravagant, they'll judge you. You do something a little bit off the mark, outside the boundaries, they'll judge you. They'll talk about you. They'll want to put you in their mold, and they'll try their best again to enslave you. I know what I'm talking about. I've been fighting them for 35 years, and I'll continue the fight. Freeing people up is one of the great callings of the minister of grace, but I'll tell you, it is a full-time task because we are so outnumbered. I sound paranoid in this. I read somewhere just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that someone's not against you. It was for freedom Christ has set you free. Don't get re-entangled in slavery. Don't let that happen. How has He set us free? Free from what? Back to Galatians 5. It was for freedom. Well, listen to the word freedom or the word deliverance. We are delivered from the power and the guilt of sin. We saw that recently in our study. We are delivered from the wrath of God. You don't live under the wrath of God. The wrath of God was settled at the cross. You live under the grace of God. He's not walking around heaven with a club and a big nail in it looking for somebody to hit because you're having fun or because you're enjoying life or because you happen to have been blessed by Him and can enjoy some things others can't enjoy. Stop letting the legalists make you feel so guilty about that. Stop taking your cues from people who want you to be as they are. Freedom from the tyranny of Satan and his demons. Freedom from the curse of the law. Freedom from its relentless demand to perform, living up to its expectations. Freedom from the fear of judgment. Freedom from an accusing conscience. Freedom from others' expectations. Freedom from lists. The lists are endless. I've made a few of them, for example. Going to the movies or live theater. Wearing cosmetics. Some groups who wear cosmetics, you're out. I've seen some people. Most need cosmetics. Those that don't, you often need it the worst. They look like unmade beds out there in the middle of the world. Playing cards, watching television, going to the beach on Sunday. Now, one of these things is going to be in your list, so you're going to enjoy it till I get to yours, and then you're going to say, well, I don't know if I ought to laugh at that. That's not... Not having a quiet time early every morning, certainly every day, can be a legalist about that. Going to a restaurant that sells liquor, wearing certain clothing, driving certain cars, especially expensive cars, especially expensive sports cars. How much more specific do I need to get? Wearing certain jewelry, wearing a lot of jewelry, wearing no jewelry, listening to certain music. Whoa. Oh, okay, it isn't as funny now, is it? Well, there's a limit, Chuck. Dancing, square, ballroom, disco, bad, whatever kind of dancing. We had a session. I won't tell you where, and I don't tell you what I'm not going to tell you about it. Well, no, there was a big discussion whether they ought to have a dance after a wedding, and when somebody brought up the subject, I said, "Are we really discussing this? I mean, is that what our agenda is today at this place? Do you care? Does it matter that a bride and groom want to dance together? I get concerned when they don't want to dance together. I mean, what's wrong with us? Well, dancing, I mean, they might lust after, well, they're bride and groom. I mean, let them do it. Golly. Finally, they got a place to handle their lust. Why do we act so spiritual about it? That's why we marry, so we won't keep burning up. That's scriptural. Holding a certain job, wearing your hair a certain way, assuming you have hair to wear a certain way, having lovely and elegant possessions, having more than one home, getting a facelift, drinking coffee. I'm not through yet. That baby goes on. Eating certain foods, working out in tight leotards, and on and on and on and on. I mean, why has that become such a thing? Because legalists love to tell you how to live your life. And they will get you in that straight and narrow, which is far more narrow than God ever had in mind. Man's narrow is always more narrow than God's when it comes to the Christian way of life. Keep on standing firm. Do not submit, verse 1, to the yoke of slavery. Get free of that. You know why you're enslaved if you are among those who are? Because you want to please people more than you want to please God. Your church has a list, so you got to live up to the list, or you're not going to be accepted. You're in the wrong church if that's what it requires to get accepted. It is not the pastor's job to give the flock a list. It's the pastor's job to preach the Word of God and let Christ and the Spirit of God give the list. Does that mean I don't have a list? I got a list, but you'll never know my list because it's none of your business. Those are the restrictions on my life. And those speed limits are strictly enforced in my life. Because that's my conscience, and that's how I must live my life. It's more narrow than some, it's much broader than others. And it's nobody's business. Nor is it my calling to require of you what I believe God requires of me. That's a big pill to swallow. Some of you are gulping hard. You're trying your best to still like Insight for Living now that the truth is out. You wished I would have named the things that are on your list so that folks would get their stuff together. Probably not. You've hung around this long. You probably are just as committed to grace as I am. Romans chapter 14. Romans 14. All of this prepares us for the wonderful statement Paul makes. I think it's one of the finest pieces ever written on living by grace in all the Bible. And if I'm given a week somewhere, it isn't long before I'm into Romans 14. Because I find if there is ever a passage worth memorizing, and I rarely have met a person who's done so, it's Romans 14. Romans 14, wonderful, wonderful guidelines. I find 4 timeless principles for freedom in Romans 14. I rarely ask you to do this, but in this case, I'm going to do it. I'd suggest you write them down. Not only because it'll help you filter it through your own mind, I think it'll come back to you a little easier in the months and years ahead. You may need them. In fact, I feel sure you will, especially when you break the bondage with legalists. Because they fight hard and they fight dirty. They're a lot tougher than you. They're not weaker brothers. They'll tell you they are and ask you not to offend them. They're professional weaker brothers, let's put it that way. You know, that's how they get in the door. Make you think they're weak. They're the strongest people in the church are the legalists. Right next to the hypocrites, and they often run together. Romans 14, 1-4 is the first principle. Let me read it for you and I'll give you the principle. Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. Look carefully now at what it says. Don't let me teach anything outside of what it says. But hold me to it if it says it. I need to teach it. Let not him who eats regard with contempt him who does not eat. Let not him who does not eat judge him who eats. For God has accepted him. The key word is accept. Notice it in verse 1. Now accept. And verse 3, God has accepted. Again it appears. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and stand he will, for the Lord is able to make him stand. Principle number 1. Accepting others is basic to cultivating freedom. Accepting others is basic to cultivating freedom. We start with love. I love that. I love the love part of it. We start with acceptance. A legalist doesn't start with acceptance. He starts by looking at you. Starts with your hair, works through your clothes, does a lot of external judging, requiring, and let me say, the one who runs wild on these back roads, forgetting the speed limit, which can be those who take grace to the wrong and abusing extreme, run roughshod over those who haven't quite caught up, the truly weak brothers and sisters. So I'm talking to both of us here, both groups. And that's why I say we start with accepting one another. Accept the one who is weak. Do you really accept the young brother or sister who doesn't know? You really give them some room to grow. And do you care about them enough to guard the expression of your liberty till they can be a part of that with you, so that much of it is enjoyed in private? It's a good question, huh? The freedom lover tends to regard with contempt. Look at verse 3. Let him who eats regard with contempt. Let not him who eats regard with contempt one who doesn't eat. And the weaker brother tends to discount or put down or judge the stronger one and to criticize him and to gossip about him. Both need to accept one another. What's this about eating? Well, in those days, the taboo was not do you dance or do you play cards, do you play dominoes, or do you work out in leotards, or do you whatever the thing. I get tired of those things. Whatever. That wasn't the taboo. In those days, do you eat meat that was once offered to idols? You see, you can use this one because this illustration doesn't offend anybody. We don't have that problem today. Those days, idol meat was offered. And they'd take a portion of the animal and they would offer it on an altar. But not all of it was consumed. Some of the meat was left over. And it would find its way into the butcher shop. The shambles, as it's called in the King James. And the shambles meat shop would cut up good juicy pieces of steak and prime rib and ribs. Man, it makes me hungry just naming all of this good stuff. Good meat, good, not contaminated, but it had been altered. It had been offered on an altar. That is, a portion of this same beast was offered on an altar, and the rest was left over for the meat market. Should you go to the meat market and buy your food there? Paul says, why not? It's good meat, eat. You like steak? Buy it. Now, the weaker brother sees you walk into a meat market buying your meat, and he's going to be uneasy. I came out of paganism. I remember those times at the altar where I burned sacrifice to my pagan gods. And now that I've come to Christ, I wouldn't think of putting that in my mouth. Well, I'm sorry. It's still good meat. So that was the taboo in those days. If you ate or if you didn't eat meat. Some just ate vegetables only till they grew to the place where they could take on meat, even meat from the shambles. But the secret is to accept each other. Now, do you love one another enough to let each other have their own choices? That's it. If your limit for a car is a Ford Taurus, that's great. Now I'm going to meddle here. Okay, if yours is a Ford Taurus, that's great. You drive Fords till you die. That's terrific. Buy one every year. Buy 3 a year. No, that's extravagant. Buy one a year and drive a Ford Taurus. That's wonderful. Or Chevy Nova. They still make a Nova. The worst car I had was a Nova. But anyway, it's another subject. Now, you may be a BMW guy. Oh, BMW, wow. Woo! Jesus wouldn't own a BMW. Who said? Who said that? How come he wouldn't? Where do you find that in the scripture? Jesus didn't have a BMW. I don't find that in there. Or Mercedes. Or Ferrari. That's even better. I mean, that's a nice idea. Why do you care what that person drives? Do you know what that person gives? If you don't, shut up. For all you know, he gives 3 times what he pays for cars once a year. I mean, it's none of your business what he drives. It's none of your business where he lives. It's none of your business what he owns. Unless, of course, you know more than anybody else. And you and God are on speaking terms, and you read it somewhere in the scriptures. Be quiet about somebody who lives on another level than you. A lot of it's just from envy. You don't like it because you can't drive it, or you don't have the guts to drive it or own it. Maybe that's the problem. It starts with accepting. Just accept him. It's a great day in my life when I forgot about what my board members drove to church. Well, I don't care if they drove a pickup with mud flaps or the dog out in the back. I didn't care. Got to where I could say, that doesn't matter. Or if they showed up in a limousine, do I care? If I love them, I don't care. It's remarkable. And if I choose not to, and I choose to give 90% of my salary to missions and 10% to live on, that's great, but that's my choice. That's not yours. I have no right to require that of you. Got it? Getting the idea here? It's acceptance. That's the underlying thing. When you really accept, you don't go with all the external stuff. You don't judge them because they do this or that. Okay, you got that first one. Number 2, verses 5 to 8. One man regards one day above another. Here we are, another issue in that day. This is a pagan holiday, you never observe. This is a holiday, you don't observe that. This is this, that's that. These are days that regard one above another. Another regards every day alike. Now the weaker brother observes certain days because that's the way he was raised. His conscience says it's okay to do that. The other regards every day alike. Let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. It's a great statement. Memorize that. Let each one be convinced in his own mind. Tell yourself that every time you're tempted to envy or judge. Hey, let him be convinced in his own mind. He's convinced with that, lives with that, great. It's okay. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord. He who eats does it for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. He who eats not for the Lord, he doesn't eat and gives thanks to God. Some eat, some don't eat. Some eat a lot, some don't eat a lot. For not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies to himself. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. That's great, great counsel. Read it a little too fast, but it's great counsel. It's a great way to live. Principle number 2. Refusing to dictate to others allows the Lord to direct their lives. Refusing to dictate to others allows the Lord to direct their lives. Go back to my earlier illustration. I know a man who drove Mercedes, several in a row, and then he began to have hard times, and he had found a hard time giving up his Mercedes, and finally had to, and realized when he gave it up, he had been spending too much of his money on a Mercedes. And now he drives a little more moderate car. He was convinced in his own mind. No one told him he needed to stop driving a Mercedes. And it was nobody's business what he drove. But he was convinced by now. Having gone through these things, I realized I had more on that in my mind than I should have, or it meant more to me than I should have. Had some kind of image wrapped up in it, and I don't need that. So for him, he decided to buy less and drive it longer. We love to control and manipulate people. We forget, let each be convinced in his own mind. Deep down, remember, we long to be free. And remember, if we long to be free, one of the great gifts we can give other people is the freedom to be free. It's wonderful to meet pastors who don't feel they need to be the conscience for their flock. Where in the Scriptures do you find that? And don't use words like modeling, because that's not what it's about either. You're modeling legalism when you try to control the people of your flock. Show you where my mind is. I like cartoons, and where I've been having my quiet time lately. And Peanuts. Snoopy is on the ice. Got a little skull cap on, doing little whirly gigs. And one of our daughters used to say little spin arounds, and he's spinning here and there. And Lucy's standing on the sideline watching him. See, he does a little twist over here. She walks up to him and says, "That's not skating, that's sliding." So he stands there and she says, "You don't have any skates on. You're just sliding on your feet. That's not skating. Skating is when you have skates on." This is still Lucy, in case you didn't get it. You're not skating at all. You're just sliding. Whew. So he walks off the ice and says to himself, "How could I have been so stupid? And he sits down on the bench and he says, I thought I was having fun. Some folks need a little time to grow up. Let them have it. Let them learn that there's a different way to be on the ice than on their feet. And this is such a neutral illustration. I could just work on this one for another 10 minutes and everybody would understand. Just let them slide. Let them learn. So they make 6 figures and you make 4. So, is God going to judge us because of the figures we make when we stand before Him? He's going to judge us with what we do with it. Some who make 6 figures keep ministries alive and well. You ever thought about that? And some who make 4 figures are just as vital to us. It's not what people make. That's why I think it's so wrong for all kinds of salaries to be announced and put in front of everybody, because it gives room for envy. It's just like fodder for the envy. And I can fall into that same trap too. I'm responsible to take care of what I make. I'm responsible to give to God what He ought to get from what I make. That's far more important than what I make. What I do with it. By the way, I never saw an example when a person made more, he suddenly gave more. Generous people are generous whether they make a lot or little. It's worth thinking about there. Principle number 3, verses 9 through 12. To this end Christ died and lived again, that He might be Lord both of the dead and the living. But you there, why do you judge your brother? You again. See, he's looking at one group. The one who doesn't eat. Why do you judge the brother who eats? Or you again. Why do you who do eat regard your brother with contempt? The one who doesn't eat. Why do we do that to each other? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of God. Verse 12. So then each one of us shall give account of himself to God. Principle number 3. Freeing others means we never assume a position we're not qualified to fill. Freeing others means we never assume a position we're not qualified to fill. You mean I'm not qualified to judge? Well, do you know every one of the facts? Private and public? Do you know motive? Do you know the past? Do you know what led to the decision the person has made? Do you know that person's roots? Do you know where that person's come from? The answer to all of these is no. It's impossible to be completely objective, furthermore. I'm very prejudiced. I was raised in a certain section of the country. I fight prejudice because I was raised by prejudiced parents. And I'm far less prejudiced than my parents were. And prejudice is a learned thing. And I did a hitch in the cord. You learn a lot about how prejudiced you can be. And you learn how valuable it is to have brothers of another color. You learn how valuable they are to you. And a culture that you would have never known about. And you need to know to be full, complete as a person. I'm very American. And I've learned in my adult years that there's better ways to do it on occasion than the way Americans do it. Learn a lot from another culture. It's so valuable. You see, I'm not objective by nature. So I'm not qualified to judge somebody. I lack the big picture. The whole picture. Sometimes someone fills in the blanks and tells me the other side of it, and I go, I never thought about that. I never thought they were struggling with that. I feel so foolish thinking, why did I even think of judging them? I didn't even know that about them. No wonder this has happened. See what I'm saying? We're not God. We don't know enough to judge. That's why we got these big logs in our own eyes. I love the way Jesus puts it. Take care of the log in your own eye. Instead of looking for, you hit them with your log when you start looking for specks that are in their eye. Oh, watch out, friend. I'm trying to get at you. Oh, watch it there. It's just a speck compared to what you got. And what I've got, we got big stuff in our own lives. And many people are fragile. They can't take your judging words. You derail them. You abuse them when you judge them. Have a heart. I love Paul Tournay's words in the Guilt and Grace book. Listen to this. So good. In all fields, even those of culture and art, other people's judgment exercises a paralyzing effect. Fear of criticism kills spontaneity. It prevents men and women from showing themselves and expressing themselves freely. Much courage is needed to paint a picture, to write a book, to erect a building designed along new architectural designs, or to formulate an independent opinion or an original thought, idea. Be careful. This includes your kids. Your kids are fragile. Doesn't mean you don't set up rules and boundaries. Please. I'm not saying, okay, kids, now that you're born, have it your way. You're talking about a house out of order. The younger they are, the more the rules. The older they get, the less the rules. When they've gotten to where they can handle it on their own, no rules. They're ready to leave the house, they're on their own. No rules. Not controlling you. My opinions are available. Ask for them. Cynthia and I have learned with our kids, now that they're grown, opinions are available and ready when asked for. When volunteered, that's not a great idea. I didn't want my folks' opinion until I asked for it when I was an adult. That's part of being an adult. Help, please. Please be very helpful with these fragile folks. In many cases, you do right by just leaving folks alone. Let them alone. Like I said earlier, it's none of our business. Okay. One more principle, and I will have accomplished offending everybody. Let's go to the last part. Verses 13 to 18. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore. There's a verse worth memorizing. But rather, let's determine not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way. Speed limit strictly enforced. I know and am convinced in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself. That's Paul's statement. He's strong. I can eat any piece of meat you put in front of me. It's just a piece of meat. Medium rare, please. Or maybe a medium. Just lay it out there. When I'm hungry, I'll gobble it up. I'm convinced of that. Sometime, however, I got to have steak all alone. Sometime, however, I need it publicly. So I got to be wise about how I eat this meat. I'm convinced nothing is unclean in itself. But to him who thinks it's unclean, to him it is unclean. Now here's where we got to accept each other. If because of food your brother is hurt, you're no longer walking according to love. See, there's a higher principle. There's a love principle. Do not destroy with your food him for whom Christ died. Therefore, do not let what is for you a good thing be spoken of as evil. Which means we got to go private with some of our liberties. Which means I don't stack a bunch of six-packs in the back of the church. When people come in to have worship service. If you'd rather not take communion, you can have a sip of beer. That's too far. It's not what you do, okay? I don't suddenly put a glass of wine at everybody's table that comes to my home for supper. I've never done that in my life. Ever. Nor will I ever do that. That's offensive for those who don't think that they should do that. I can't jam some liberty if that happens to be mine, and you'll never know if it is. That happens to be my freedom. That's not going to be something I'm going to force on you or demand of you or judge you because you don't or do. If because of food your brother is hurt, you're not walking according to love. I love the people I have for dinner. I love the fact that God's growing them into strong and able and interdependent adults and maturing them. I love that. I don't have a right to dictate what they eat and drink and wear and drive and live in and own. I don't know enough to do that. Therefore, verse 16, do not let what is for you a good thing be spoken of as evil. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that wise? Love Paul's logic here. Principle number 4. Loving others requires us to express our liberty wisely. Loving others requires us to express our liberty wisely. I'm uncomfortable around bullying Christians because I'm not seeing maturity in action. I'm seeing adolescence. I'm seeing liberty without control. I'm seeing liberty without love. So I don't know how to give you all the details of this. I can't give you a script. If I did, that'd be my list. I just have learned how to do it, and sometimes I blow it, sometimes I don't. Usually I get it down pretty well. I've learned over the years through mistakes not to do this or to do that, not to say this or to say that. But you'd be amazed how many long for a life of liberty. That's why people want Christ. They're tired of the bondage. Got a great story for you. Written by a man named Robert Moeller. A friend of ours sold encyclopedias door to door in California. She was following up on a phone lead and came to the second floor of an apartment building. She knocked on the door, and the man opened it. She gulped. She could see from the emblem on his leather jacket he belonged to a notorious motorcycle gang. She thought about leaving, but his polite manner and genuine interest in her product persuaded her to stay. He invited her to come into the living room and make her presentation. As she walked in, she noticed another member of the gang happened to be there. She made her sales pitch, but was constantly interrupted by the second gang member. "Shut up," the first gang member said to his friend. "I want to hear what she has to say." But he continued to make snide and impolite remarks to our friend. "You'll have to excuse me for a moment," said the first gang member. Went over to his obnoxious friend, dragged him to the balcony of the apartment, threw him over the side. My friend was horrified, but managed to remain calm. When the gang member casually took his place on the sofa again, he said, "I apologize for the interruption. Please go on." While motorcycle gang members aren't known for their kind of affection for one another, it did seem out of place for one member to throw another off the balcony. And then he goes on to say, ouch. The well-publicized televangelist scandals of the late 80s did minimal harm to the reputation of the church in our culture. That is, in comparison to the true scandal of our time. The true scandal is the way Christians mistreat one another, fighting and conducting uncivil wars against one another. Missionaries can do it. Pastors can do it. Board members can do it. Church members can do it. Non-church members can do it. Anybody in the body of Christ can do it. We can go too far, too. And don't miss this, or I'll be labeled as a libertine, and I've got enough mail to answer without having to answer that mail. The speed limit is strictly enforced. Even on the back roads, it'll say 40 miles an hour. You don't get on the back roads to go 90. You got to drive real carefully on these back roads. They're beautiful. They're free. They're fun. But you can't take things in your own strength and write your own rules and live as if to say to hell with the rest of the world. That's not grace. That's not love. Having said that, may I add that anyone who exercises any measure of liberty is going to offend someone. So live with it. See, the legalist would tell you they're weak, or let you know that in so many whiny ways. And they'll leave you with the idea if you do this, you offend them, and that's wrong. I'm not sure it's wrong to offend a legalist. I don't know of any other way to get their attention. I think it's wrong to offend a weaker brother. I'm not nearly as worried about a legalist as I am about a young brother trying to get underway, get started. Has a very sensitive conscience. Is kind of getting new in the faith. He's really, really trying to get his sea legs. I got to be a little tender with him. I don't shove him into a storm and say, okay, you got the boat to yourself. I'm right there with you. And I even admit it when I'm scared. Someone wrote it this way, called letting go. Listen to every word of it and I'm through. To let go doesn't mean to stop caring. It means I can't do it for someone else. To let go is not to cut myself off. It's the realization that I cannot control another. To let go is not to enable, but to allow learning from natural consequences. To let go is to admit powerlessness, which means the outcome is not in my hands. To let go is not to try to change or blame another. I can only change myself. To let go is not to care for, but to care about. To let go is not to fix, but to be supportive. To let go is not to judge, but to allow another to be a human being. To let go is not to be in the middle arranging all the outcomes, but to allow others to affect their own outcomes. To let go is not to be protective. It is to permit another to face reality. To let go is not to deny, but to accept. To let go is not to nag, scold, or argue, but to search out my own shortcomings and to correct them. To let go is not to adjust everything to my desires, but to take each day as it comes. To let go is not to criticize and regulate anyone, but to try to become what dream I can be. To let go is not to regret the past, but to grow and live for the future. To let go is to fear less and love more. Our Father, we acknowledge that in our own strength and because of our old habits, this is a tough message to hear. It's a tough one to preach and to keep it in balance. I run the risk of being misunderstood, but I believe, Lord, before you, it's worth the risk. And I pray that at least one person will be freed from the clutches of a legalist, having heard what's been said. And at least one person who has been bullying another individual will be released from that need to play king of the mountain. I pray that you will help parents of the young to be all the more concerned for their children, to guide them and to direct their steps and to set the right boundaries, to love, but also to discipline, to explain why, and then to be consistent in carrying it out. Oh, Father, as we grow up, help us to release one another to you, the Father of us all, rather than to feel we have been called to be in charge of the world, because we are not. Help us mainly, Father, to love someone enough to adjust our freedom for their good. And I pray that as a result of a message like this, only good will come. Pressure will be relieved, and freedom will return and be enjoyed. For Jesus' sake. And everybody said, amen.
Insight for Living is grateful to St. Martin's Press for permission to use Michael Wallace's book, Route 66, The Mother Road, in the foregoing message. Copyright 1990, St. Martin's Press, New York, New York.